Why do you keep running such an unstable business in that old apartment forever? Why don't you get a proper job already? Allison, I'm saying this for your own good. Only the words my younger sister, Vanessa Morgan, spat out while idly toying with her crystal glass echoed through the room. This was a private dining room at an upscale restaurant my mother, Natalie Morgan, loved to frequent. 6 years had passed since my father died, and every family gathering had inevitably turned into a place where my so called failures were assumed and relentlessly ridiculed. Vanessa had recently been promoted to senior associate at one of New York's most prestigious law firms. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, with her hair immaculately styled and a triumphant smile on her lips, she looked every bit the image of success. To her, success meant visible titles and a status that drew envy from everyone around her. Vanessa is right. How long do you plan to cling to that apartment? My mother looked at me with a cold, cutting stare. The $35,000 your father left you. You were supposed to use that as capital to start your business, yet it still hasn't shown any results. That money should have been managed by someone who actually understands its value. Like Vanessa, what you're doing is no different from playing in the mud. I quietly placed my napkin on my lap and looked straight at the two of them. The place they sneered at as a rundown apartment was a historic red brick building along the Hudson River, one that still retained the atmosphere of the late 19th century. It was true that when I first purchased it, the pipes were rusted through, the walls were peeling, and it was a property on the verge of becoming a ruin that no one wanted to touch. But I could see it, the genuine beauty sleeping behind those soot darkened bricks. For 6 years, I painted the walls with my own hands, persuaded local craftsmen to restore the original decorative details, and discreetly integrated modern smart home technology into its traditional design. It was not the kind of symbolic success Vanessa chased after, but something tangible I could pass on to the next generation. And that was my pride. Thank you for worrying about me, but the business is going well. When I answered briefly, Vanessa let out an exaggerated sigh. Going well, don't lie to us. With a building that old, it's obvious the maintenance costs alone would put you in the red. Dad never imagined his money would be wasted like this. That was a loan, and you don't even show any intention of paying it back? A loan? I frowned. When my father handed me that money, he looked me straight in the eyes and said this: "This is an investment in your dream. Of course, there's no need to repay it. Make the path you believe in a reality." But my mother and Vanessa clearly didn't see it that way. That's right. It's a perfectly legitimate debt, Allison. My mother said it as if to drive the point home. We have proof of that, you know. You should know your place. Don't you think the best way to get back to your parents before you embarrass yourself any further is to sell that apartment and let Vanessa handle the asset management? I did not miss the unmistakable glint of possessiveness shining deep in Vanessa's eyes. She did not want to help me, and she simply wanted to drag me down as a failure and prove that she alone was the family's one legitimate heir. That night, with a sense of an approaching storm weighing heavily on me, I drove back to my apartment. At the time, I still could not fully grasp that this was a declaration of war from the very family that sought to destroy me. 2 weeks after the unpleasant dinner at the restaurant, as usual, I greeted the morning in my apartment, Leisurewood Terrace, which stood on a hill overlooking the Hudson River. To me, this building was not merely real estate, but the very embodiment of my dream, the one my late father had believed in. With a freshly brewed cup of coffee in hand, I gazed out the window. That peaceful moment, however, was suddenly shattered by a heavy, ominous knock. When I opened the door, a man with a blank expression stood there. Miss Allison Morgan? What he held out to me was an envelope from the court. The instant it was placed in my hand, a sickening premonition ran through my fingertips. So when I broke the seal and checked the contents, I nearly felt dizzy. Complaint for loan repayment? Plaintiffs, Natalie Morgan and Vanessa Morgan. The contents were far more malicious than I could ever have imagined. Jonathan Morgan, the deceased father, lent the defendant, Allison Morgan, $35,000 as startup capital. This was not a gift, but an interest bearing loan, and the total sum of $47,000, including unpaid interest, must be repaid immediately. Attached to it was a copy of a single document, loan agreement. There, side by side, were my father's signature and what appeared to be my own distorted signature. This can't be. It's a lie. My heart began to pound violently. On the day my father gave me that money, there had not been a single piece of paperwork. He had simply taken my hand, smiled, and said, "Trust your intuition." This contract had to be a fabrication. With trembling fingers, I called my mother. "Mom, what is this supposed to mean? Taking me to court? Are you really going to ignore the promise you made to Dad?" What came through the receiver was my mother's voice, cold and utterly devoid of mercy. Oh, so it finally reached you. Your father spoiled you far too much, Allison, but I have no intention of indulging your little mud play any longer. With those $35,000, Vanessa could have made far higher status investments. Once that apartment is seized, you'll finally admit your own incompetence and come crawling back home, won't you? Seized? That's right. Once the ruling is issued, that rundown apartment of yours will be put up for auction. Vanessa handled everything. She's a professional lawyer after all. You don't stand a chance. Behind my mother's words lay not only contempt for me, but blind faith in Vanessa. Vanessa perfectly played the role of the successful daughter my mother desired while scheming behind the scenes to take everything from me. Gita, I understand if you're going that far, then I'll prepare to fight as well. Don't put on a brave face. You don't even have the money left to hire a lawyer. She spat the words out and hung up the phone. I set the receiver down and stared at the brick walls outside the window, the walls I had protected for so long. What my father gave me was not just $35,000 in cash. He gave me the pride to stand on my own 2 feet. Tarnishing that was something I could not allow, even if it came from my own family. Vanessa, if you're willing to stake your career as a lawyer on this, then I'll face you head on. I immediately went to see Daniel Brooks, a lawyer who had been an old friend of my father. In his quiet office, far removed from the hustle and bustle of New York, he studied the complaint and the copy of the contract I had brought with him, peering at them through his reading glasses. This is awful. It looks very much like Jonathan's signature, but something about it feels off. Daniel leaned back deeply into his chair and let out a sigh. The law firm Vanessa belongs to is notorious for using any means necessary to win. She's especially desperate to prove that she is the leader of the family through this case. Proving that these documents are forged will be no easy task. I know, but I don't want my promise with my father to be defiled. Very well, first, you need to thoroughly comb through any records from when your father gave you the money, bank transaction histories, emails from that time, even diaries. Jonathan was a meticulous man. There must be something left behind that describes the nature of that money. Taking Daniel's advice to heart, I began a lonely battle to search for evidence from that very day. During the day, I immersed myself in managing and restoring the apartment. At night, I shut myself away in the small study tucked into one corner of the building. There, several cardboard boxes were stacked high, boxes I had taken as keepsakes when my father died 6 years earlier. My mother and Vanessa had laughed and said, "Why not just throw out that old junk already?" But I could never bring myself to do it. My father's cherished fountain pen, old ledgers, and the history books he loved to read. Carefully opening each dust covered box one by one felt like quietly resuming a conversation with my father, a sacred and solemn time. Vanessa had always been the type who could never tolerate anything that threatened her status. Even when I was a child, when one of my drawings won a prize in a competition, she dismissed it as nothing more than luck, then spent the following year obsessively working until she herself won an even bigger award. For her, life always had to be a victory, measured only by comparison with someone else. This time, too, I was certain that her decision to sue me was not simply about money. It came from a twisted obsession to legally brand me as a failure and to seize even the love and trust I had received from our father and claim them as her own. About a week later, I finally found my father's old leather-bound diary. It was a personal memorandum he had kept faithfully until just before his death. As I turned the pages, my father's familiar handwriting leapt out at me. March 15th, 20XX. I gave Allison $35,000. Linda will surely oppose it, but in that child's eyes, I saw the same passion I once had myself. This is an investment in her dream and in my own. No matter what others may say, I believe in her. Tucked inside the diary was a copy of an old bank transfer receipt bearing a handwritten note in my father's careful script. An investment in my daughter's dream. A gift. By the time I finished reading, tears were falling onto the pages. Clutching the diary to my chest, I called Daniel. "I found it, Daniel. My father's true will." Even so, Vanessa was a formidable opponent. The contract she submitted bore a forged signature so meticulously crafted that even experts would struggle to tell it apart from the real one. On top of that, Vanessa set another despicable trap in preparation for the trial. It was a mandatory inspection of my apartment conducted by a court-appointed real estate appraiser. She believed that if the apartment received a low valuation, I would be treated as an insolvent debtor with no ability to repay, making it far easier for them to seize the property. I accepted the challenge in silence. The reality they believed in versus the truth I had spent 6 years building with my own hands. The day when the answer would be revealed was drawing closer with every passing moment. The day of the trial. As the courtroom doors opened, a cold tension hung in the air. My mother sat in the plaintiff's seat, absently fingering her pearl necklace while staring at me as if I were something filthy. Beside her sat Vanessa, her lawyer's badge gleaming proudly, her posture flawless and unwavering. A defiant smile played across her face. Today, we will prove just how the defendant, Allison Morgan, betrayed her family's goodwill and squandered the inheritance left by her late father. Vanessa Morgan's voice rang clearly through the courtroom. Her argument was smooth, passionate, and carried a compelling force that drew in everyone listening. She held up the so-called loan agreement allegedly left by my father as evidence and insisted that I had never repaid the debt, even once, choosing instead to run away from my obligation. My father, Jonathan Morgan, was a strict businessman. There is no way he would have handed over the enormous sum of $35,000 to a daughter who was unemployed at the time without expecting anything in return. This contract is proof of his rational judgment. And yet the defendant repaid that kindness with betrayal, pouring the money into a worthless piece of real estate and now standing on the brink of bankruptcy with no prospect of repayment. Vanessa turned toward me once and hurled her words with open contempt. Allison, your illusion called a dream ends here today. The judge turned his gaze toward me. Counsel for the defense, do you have a rebuttal? Beside me, Daniel Brooks rose quietly to his feet. Yes, Your Honor. We categorically deny the authenticity of the contract submitted by the plaintiffs. Furthermore, we will present irrefutable evidence that clearly demonstrates the true intent of the late Jonathan Morgan. Daniel presented my father's diary, which I had discovered, along with the bank transfer receipt. The plaintiffs have used the phrase strict businessman, but what my client's father valued above all else was trust. Please look at the entry dated March 15th in this diary. In addition, the memo field on the bank transfer record clearly contains the word gift written in the father's own handwriting. Is there any clearer evidence than this? For a brief moment, Vanessa's expression froze solid, but she quickly let out a derisive snort. Your Honor, an old diary like that could easily be fabricated. However, the contract I possess bears a legally binding signature. It should be obvious which one deserves your trust. Then let us discuss that signature. Daniel produced yet another document. We commissioned one of the nation's leading handwriting analysts to examine the signature on the contract submitted by the plaintiffs. The conclusion was that while the writing habits closely resemble those of the deceased, the pen pressure and ink pooling differ from his usual patterns, leading to the assessment that it was highly likely a forgery produced with exceptional precision. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. I could see the color draining from Vanessa's face. Her pride, her status as a lawyer, and her conviction that she alone was the rightful heir all began to crumble audibly. Yet the judge remained calm. The credibility of documentary evidence requires careful consideration. Now then, in connection with this lawsuit, the court has received the report from the court-ordered appraisal of the defendant's property. Let us review its contents here as well. Vanessa straightened her back at once, as if to conceal her momentary agitation. She was still convinced of her own victory. After all, to her, that apartment was nothing more than a worthless rundown building. She believed that if the property were given a low valuation, my ability to repay would be denied, and regardless of whether the contract was genuine or not, I would be cornered and branded a failure. Yes, Your Honor, please go ahead and read out the value of that building, which is no better than trash. That should make it even clearer who is telling the truth. Vanessa looked at me with a triumphant expression. The courtroom fell into a heavy, deathly silence. The report in the judge's hands. It was the official appraisal prepared by a real estate appraiser appointed by the court. Vanessa exchanged confident glances with my mother seated beside her. The appraiser stepped up to the witness stand. I will now report the results of our investigation. The appraiser's voice echoed heavily through the dry courtroom. The subject property, Leisurewood Terrace, located along the Hudson River, built in 1892 prior to our inspection based on materials provided by the plaintiffs. We had assumed it to be a dilapidated structure, little more than a ruin. However, what our on-site inspection team encountered was a scene that could only be described as a miracle in today's real estate market. Vanessa's eyebrow twitched. The defendant, Allison Morgan, spent 6 years carrying out a complete renovation of this historic building. The exterior red brick was reconstructed using mortar blended to replicate the original 19th century composition, and the stained glass at the entrance was restored by a Tiffany-style workshop. Even more remarkable is the interior. Without compromising the traditional design in any way, state-of-the-art thermal and sound insulation panels have been embedded within the walls, and a top-tier smart home system has been installed throughout every unit. The appraiser turned a page of the report and adjusted his glasses. Of particular note is the property's occupancy record. This apartment building has gained extraordinary popularity among New York's wealthy residents and artists as a word-of-mouth only hidden retreat. The current occupancy rate is 100%. The waiting list now includes more than 50 prospective tenants. The annual rental income, calculated as net profit after expenses, amounts to an astonishing $248,000. What did you say? A faint, disbelieving voice escaped from my mother's lips. Her hand trembled as it gripped the armrest of her chair. The appraiser continued as if delivering the final blow. Taking into account current market trends, historical value, and profitability, I have calculated the final appraisal of the asset. The market value of this property does not fall below $4 million at present. The courtroom erupted into an explosive roar of noise. $4 million? That's impossible. Vanessa sprang to her feet, letting out a cry that sounded more like a scream than something befitting a lawyer. This has to be some kind of mistake. There's no way a place that old, a building that looks like it's haunted, could be worth that much. She's nothing but a failure. She was supposed to have just thrown Dad's money straight into the gutter. I rose slowly to my feet. Before Daniel could stop me, I stepped forward on my own, and I locked eyes with my sister, who was shouting with a trembling voice, "Vanessa, you never saw anything, did you?" My quiet voice cut through her screaming and echoed across the courtroom. Have you ever once tried to imagine what I was doing in that place you sneered at and called a haunted house? For 6 years, I went down into that apartment's basement every single day and wrestled with 130-year-old plumbing diagrams. Even on freezing winter nights covered in soot, I polished the original bricks one by one with my own hands, careful not to damage them. While you were sipping coffee elegantly in a luxurious office, I was out there in the Hudson River's icy wind, adjusting the angle of each roof tile one by one. I could see the color draining rapidly from Vanessa's face. When you started this lawsuit, I chose not to say anything on purpose. It was convenient for me that you believed I was a failure. But Vanessa, the annual net profit of that rundown apartment you despise so much exceeds $240,000, and its market value easily surpasses the salary you've been spending your entire life trying to reach by chasing a partner track at your law firm. After taking a breath, I slammed another file Daniel handed me down onto Vanessa's table. And as for this contract, I'll explain it myself. Vanessa's shoulders jerked. Vanessa, you made a fatal mistake as a lawyer. I asked an engineer I know to recover every single output history you forgot to delete from your firm's servers. And there was the log data from 3 months ago showing you used the Office multifunction printer to scan Dad's signature and produce this forged contract. What? Why do you have something like that? Because I knew just how cruel you could be when it came to protecting your status. Using Dad's signature to frame me and Vanessa and trying so hard to win against me, you crossed a line that a lawyer must never cross. I turned to my mother as she sat there with her mouth half open, looking as if she had seen a ghost. And you, Mom, you went along with Vanessa's lies too, but what a shame. What I built over these past 6 years isn't some cheap dream you could seize. It's an unshakable success, one that your imagination can't even begin to catch up to. Vanessa collapsed weakly into her chair, and the suit that had once been perfect was now damp with the sweat of despair. The arrogant light in her eyes had vanished, replaced by a flood of fear as her career began to crumble before her. The judge struck the gavel heavily. Order, Defendant Allison Morgan. The evidence you have presented suggests facts of the utmost seriousness. All eyes in the courtroom turned and pierced into Vanessa at once. There was no longer any escape. After alternating his gaze between the contract submitted by Vanessa and the multifunction printer log data I had presented, the judge fixed Vanessa with a cold, unyielding stare. Counsel for the plaintiffs, Vanessa Morgan, you're suspected of having committed one of the most abhorrent acts for anyone in the legal profession: the fabrication of evidence presented before this court. This matter goes far beyond a mere family financial dispute and constitutes a grave challenge to the integrity of the judiciary. Accordingly, this lawsuit seeking repayment of a loan is hereby dismissed in its entirety, effective immediately due to the failure to establish the authenticity of the evidence. The moment those words echoed through the courtroom, Vanessa collapsed into her chair like a puppet with its strings cut. But the judge was not finished. Furthermore, Ms. Vanessa Morgan, your actions may constitute criminal offenses, including forgery of a private document bearing a seal and litigation fraud. This court will forward all related materials to the competent prosecutor's office and request consideration of criminal charges. In addition, a formal recommendation will be submitted to the State Bar Association seeking disciplinary action against you. Criminal charges, disciplinary action. Vanessa muttered the words hollowly. The status of lawyer, which she had staked her entire life on obtaining, was slipping through her fingers. Her face was drained of color, and no words of rebuttal came from her trembling lips. When the trial ended and I stepped out into the hallway, I found it packed with relatives who had been waiting eagerly for my defeat. But the words $4 million and fabrication of evidence, which had leaked out of the courtroom, had completely shifted where they stood. Allison? An aunt rushed toward me with a smile that flipped instantly like a turned palm. To think you had turned that apartment into something so valuable. I always knew you were Arthur's daughter. We had no idea Vanessa was capable of something so terrible. That's right, Allison. If you ever run into trouble, you should always rely on your family. Even my cousins, who moments earlier had refused to meet my eyes, now crowded around me like ants swarming sugar. What I saw in their eyes was not respect for me, but desire for the number $4 million that hovered behind me. I looked quietly at each of their faces in turn. Then I spoke clearly. Everyone, don't misunderstand. I don't need any of your help. When I was polishing bricks alone, did a single one of you ever lend me a hand? You came here today to laugh at my failure. Didn't you? If that's the case, then please play that role all the way to the end. As my relatives fell silent, I stepped in front of my mother and Vanessa, who was standing there unsteadily. My mother wore a frightened expression. Allison, you'll let your mother rent a room in that apartment too, won't you? With Vanessa like this, how we're supposed to live from now on? Mom, just a moment ago, you called me an incompetent daughter and tried to take my home away from me. I said it in a voice so cold it surprised even me. I am not your property, and you will receive not a single cent of profit from me. This is the end. Do not ever contact me again. Allison, wait, leaving my mother's scream behind me, I walked out of the courthouse without turning around even once. 6 months later, a feature article appeared on the front page of the Sunday edition of the New York Times. Guardian of History, the young female entrepreneur who transformed a Hudson River ruin into one of America's most exclusive luxury properties. The article featured photographs of the beautifully restored Leisurewood Terrace, along with a detailed account of my approach to preserving historical value while maximizing profitability through cutting-edge technology. The waiting list for my property grew even longer, and among celebrities and tech moguls hoping to move in, gaining my approval had become a status symbol in itself. As my own life grew brighter, I heard from Daniel that the situation facing my mother and Vanessa was bleak and cold. Vanessa had been permanently disbarred, and the major law firm she once belonged to was reportedly considering a lawsuit for damages, citing harm to its reputation. And the mansion my mother had cherished above all else was put up for auction to cover Vanessa's enormous legal fees and compensation payments. I was told that the two of them moved into an old rental apartment in the suburbs. Apparently, it was such a damp, cramped place that it made their former habit of mocking my apartment as a rundown shack sound like a bad joke. For women who had lived off status and luxury as their primary nourishment, life there must have been more painful than death itself. I never wanted revenge. They had simply tried to turn my father's love into money and trample on my pride. As the price for that, they ended up spending the rest of their lives experiencing the very bottom tier existence they had despised the most. Having severed the chains called family and gained the strength to believe in myself, I built my own place in the world with my own hands, just as my father believed I would.